But what you get here is the oldest Jewish graveyard in Berlin. This is the first graveyard they established when they moved here towards the end of the 18th century. But the last body was buried here officially in the early 19th century or so about the 1820s. But unfortunately, towards the end of World War II, it was desecrated. The Nazis actually dug an air raid ditch through it, and they used the gravestones to reinforce the sides of the ditch, and they actually just heaped the bodies up as well on the side as well, so it was desecrated. And then immediately after the war as well, with the huge destruction in Berlin from air raids, and that there was numerous bodies lying around. They actually buried about 2,500 bodies in here then on top of it, so civilians, German soldiers, even Russian soldiers in here. It has been somewhat restored today. Those bodies were removed, and that the graveyard has been reconsecrated. But as you can see, there's no grave tombs, or there's no grave markers in here, tombstones or tombs or anything. There's a few examples of what the original ones would have looked like just inside the gate here, and there is a plaque for one of the most famous people buried here in the graveyard. That's Moses Mendelssohn. So he was a Jewish German writer and thinker, and that inspired what's called the Jewish Enlightenment. The Jewish Enlightenment encouraged greater integration into the non-Jewish community, in that advocates and followers of this idea of the Jewish Enlightenment went to universities, they started businesses, they started intermarrying and stuff like that. And Berlin was very much the center of that, meaning there was a very well integrated and very visible Jewish community in Berlin, even if there were only quite a relatively small minority within the city itself. But what you also get here today is we're on top of two memorials. The first one is, if you see these red stones here, this marks the floor plan of a former Jewish old folks home that used to be at this site. And like many of these, Jewish community centers, schools, old folks homes, it was also converted into a deportation point for Berlin's Jewish community here, particularly the elderly, who would have been sent on to Theresienstadt, just outside of Prague, in the Czech Republic, and many there then onwards on to Auschwitz, the death camps as well. Deportations usually function that most people were taken in the middle of the night, or the SS showed up at their house. They didn't tell them directly why they were taking them. They told them that they were being taken into protective custody. That was actually the official term used for people they arrested to send to the camps. They referred to them as Schutzhäftlinge, like protective prisoners or protective inmates that they're being taken into custody for their own protection. So then, to keep this kind of veneer of legitimacy going, they were brought to Jewish assembly points, and that often still Jewish people here running those, and that there was actual Jews who cooperated with the Nazis in the deportation of their own people, and that before being loaded onto trains or trucks and then being deported to the actual camps as well. Here as well, you have this, with the fence here and all that goes through the graveyard. This is actually just a perimeter around the Jewish school here. Also functioned as a Jewish assembly point, but it's still actually a school as well, so it's still a Jewish school here. And of course, the other memorial you have here are the figures here, the 12 figures here. This is slightly older. It was originally, the first 6 or so figures were sculpted in the 1950s, but the actual sculptor, a guy called Lammert, died in about 1957, so it was left unfinished. His son finished them then in the late 70s, early 80s. But this was the memorial I mentioned that was only added in 1987. We're still within East Berlin. Everyone was overlooked by the East Germans except for communists. And then when they did discuss other people, it was always in this kind of communist ideology vizier, that communism would protect these people, and that, or the solidarity of communists with these groups within the concentration camps, and that again, of course, it's almost an iconic image of the starved, emancipated camp inmates, and you can see, of course, it's an active memorial. This year is 70 years since the end of the Second World War, so many of these memorials have had different commemorations and events going on around them. As well, and of course this tradition of stones is a big one that I get asked about a lot, and I've heard so many different theories about what it is. All of them sound equally valid. One is that it simply just marks a visit, so each stone is a visitor to this site. Other ones are that they're an alternative to flowers, because first of all, many Jews historically in the Middle East, and that not many flowers available. The other one is flowers wither eventually, while stones won't. Stones last longer as well. And there was also how many bodies would have been buried originally in the Middle East and Israel, and that stones were piled up on top of them rather than burying them underground as we're used to. So there is other memorials along the street here, but we'll actually walk to them. I'll first of all give you a few minutes to check out the graveyard here, and then we'll push the bikes a little bit down the street check out the first one and then a little bit further down. But guys, if you want to take a minute or two and just walk into the graveyard and see the tombstones or take pictures of the memorial here. The building next door has been completely restored. It's gone, so it's slowly disappearing, except for around the door. Yeah, there's still a bit there. We'll see more of this as well. Sometimes it's hard to tell exactly whether it's bullet damage, if there was actual fighting in this area, whether bombs or artillery. Focused around the windows, it's often somebody had held out in the building against the Russians, resulting in fighting around the building, a lot of damage there, that there were snipers in the building or whatever, and that it was just randomly scattered across the facade of the building. It was probably during the air raids or artillery. The Russians, of course, had thousands of artillery units aimed at Berlin towards the final battle of Berlin. The other thing, and the main reason I stopped here, is for these little brass cobblestones. They almost look like here on street. These are called Stolpersteine, or stumbling blocks, is the idea that people are obviously meant to notice them, kind of stop and look. The first ones were laid in the early 1990s, and it didn't start as we see it at the moment. It was actually a very simple brass plaque that was placed outside the town hall in Cologne in West Germany, and on it had the dates and the numbers of the deportation of Roman Sinti gypsies from Cologne. The artist Demnig had felt that Roman Sinti gypsies were being overlooked, that this significant anniversary where Cologne's Roman Sinti community had been deported wasn't being significantly commemorated by the city government, and that so really as a small protest he placed one of these plaques outside the town hall. Now the story goes to him, in an interview he said that afterwards, during the action, like when the plaque was there and people were looking at it, a woman approached him and said, but there was no Roman Sinti in my street or my neighborhood or whatever. And hearing this, he actually had an action where in a street in Cologne, he started putting down these blocks with people's names on them outside the homes of Roman Sinti gypsies who became victims of National Socialism, so had been deported to the camps. And it grew out of that. People started asking, will you do it in my street? What about, I'd love to get one outside this building for this person. And today it's a foundation that you can actually donate to, and they'll install a block on your behalf. The one interesting little thing to that is you can't specify who it's going to commemorate. You can say which city you want it in, what area, but you can't say whose name's going to be on the block. It sounds funny because you'd think, of course, a big thing would be survivors wanting to commemorate family members and stuff like that. But if you look here at the blocks, you see there's whole families gone. Like Reisner's here, there's 3 of them. There's the 2 Finks here, and that top it says here lived, so here wohnte, the person's name, the year they were born, so the JG is Jahr geboren, the year they were born. And it varies a lot in how much information is actually on the bottom part of the block. Some of them are just, deported in 1941 and where they were murdered at. But you can see almost the history of the Holocaust just in this spot here. Riga, for example, towards the very end of the war, big work camp in Riga. There was mass exterminations carried out there simply by taking people out into the forest and shooting them in massive numbers. Our next stop, though, is when you're ready, we'll hop on the bike and we'll be just straight down the street here. You can see it. We'll be stopping across the way from the new synagogue. It's called the Jewish Synagogue. And here, of course, is for the new synagogue down here. Built in the 1840s, very much a reflection of the position and prestige of the Jewish community at the time in Berlin. As I said, they were quite well integrated. They were very present in academia, in industry, and even in the city government as well. Most other synagogues are hidden down little side streets and that. They're very common street names in Germany, like Judenstraße, so Jew Street, or Judengasse as well, which is like Gasse being a laneway, so implying that down that street there would have been a Jewish community or Jewish synagogue. So most is quite hidden away. This one is very different, of course, because of the massive impact it has on the skyline, the beautiful dome on top. As well, the building, it actually survived the night of broken glass, surprisingly. The night of broken glass, or Reichskristallnacht, as it's called in German, was in 1938 that these discriminatory policies against Jewish people actually turned violent. So between 1933 and 1938, it was mostly discriminating against them. They lost their jobs and that they were being intimidated by the brown shirts. And that 1938, there is this shift from discriminatory laws to actual violent action and deportation of Jewish people from German towns and cities. The change comes about because in 1938, any Jews with a Polish connection, they were ordered to be deported by Hitler ordered them deported back to Poland. So visas weren't renewed, residency permits weren't renewed, and that. And about 15,000 Jewish people, the first group of these being deported, were on their way back to Poland when Poland closed the border to them, and they ended up in a camp along the German-Polish border, receiving only assistance from the International Red Cross. One of the families, the Griezkans, had a son studying in Paris. That was actually quite common, where Jewish family, if they had the money, would have at least send one son abroad to get him away from the oppression that they were experiencing under National Socialism. But their son Herschel, studying in Paris, received a letter from his sister about the conditions in the camp at the time, and he went to the German embassy demanding to know what was going on, why they weren't helping his family. The ambassador at the time made some excuses and Herschel left, but he came back about 3 days later and again demanded to see the diplomat or to see the ambassador. But they sent out the number 3 man, a guy called Ernst von Rath. And once he came out, Herschel Greifswald introduced a pistol and shot von Rath. Now von Rath survived the initial gunshot, but straight away the German media, all under Nazi control at this point, went into overdrive. And they started, publishing big headlines of Jew shoots German, Jews are a threat to the Germans. That this one, Jewish attack on a German person was a justification for all these anti-Jewish policies under the Nazis. And when Ernst von Rath dies on the 9th of November, again, it's extreme. They go all out saying Jew kills German, the Jews are a threat to Germans. All the high-ranking Nazis make speeches, not saying like go out and kill Jews, but implying that it's understandable that the Germans would be so angry that this has happened, that there might be repercussions and reprisals against the Jewish community. They basically said it's we're not saying do it, but we're saying it's okay if people do it. It's understandable if people do so. The reality was though that most of the people who carried out the attacks on the night of broken glass wore actually the brown shirts. The brown shirts were the Nazi thugs. They were their strong men. The people going around breaking skulls, getting into riots and fights with communists and other anti-Nazi groups. But on this night they went out in plain clothes to make it look like, so rather than wearing their typical uniform of brown shirts and that to distinguish themselves as supporters of the Nazi party, they went out in plain civilian clothes to make it look like an organic uprising, as if it really was just average Germans who went out and attacked Jewish businesses, thousands of synagogues burned, about 90 Jewish people killed in the streets outright. In the weeks and months afterwards, about 30,000 Jewish people actually deported to the camps for the first time. So at that time you had Dachau, Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen north of Berlin, and you had Jewish people deported to those camps as well. And massive destruction here in this area because of course a Jewish centre of Berlin at the time. But surprisingly the Jewish synagogue itself survived. On the evening of the 9th of November 1938, brown shirts had already broken into the building and they were trashing the interior, the prayer room. And when a local police officer, a guy called Kutzfeld, showed up and actually scared them off. Now his motivations are up for debate. He has been honoured by Germany and Israel for intervening and saving the synagogue and that. But it's possible that he had more pragmatic motivations, some of them quite simple. For example, this quite beautiful but dilapidated building here next to us was the former Central Telegraph office, so a very important building at the time. Further down on the street on the right, currently being converted into a luxury hotel with a Central Post Office. So it's two very important buildings very close to the synagogue here. So if this building was set on fire, the fire would spread and do damage to the surrounding buildings. That could have been part of his motivation. And the other one is that he could have been a Nazi himself and just realised that there would have been a huge amount of documentation in this building that could be used to track down Jewish people and identify Jewish people as well for later on. Whatever his motivation, the building was saved, but unfortunately it didn't survive the bombing during the Second World War. It took a lot of damage in 1943 due to Allied air raids of Berlin. But a lot of the facade is actually original. It was mostly that the dome on top was destroyed and the back of the building took a lot of damage as well. But the facade is original. But unfortunately, after the war, it was left in ruins, and the East German government actually required other parts of it to be torn down. They claimed that they were a danger to the surrounding buildings and that the remaining structure was dangerous. So the building itself was only restored in 1995. Now, the motivations of the East German government of not allowing them to restore it wasn't necessarily to target the Jewish community. Communists in general are just a very anti-religion. There was numerous churches in Berlin that were torn down completely, whatever their conditions were. Some of them because they were too close to the Berlin Wall, and it was just the same here. Because they opposed religion, they didn't approve of the reconstruction of the new synagogue here. But this was restored in 1995. Opened on the 8th of May 1995, so to commemorate 50 years on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. This building was reopened, although I kind of phrased it wrong there. It's not fully restored. Today it's an exhibition space, and that there's a permanent exhibition in here about the local Jewish community. It doesn't actually function as a synagogue today, but the beautiful dome on top has been fully restored, and that the other smaller domes at the front as well. But there are numerous other synagogues in Berlin as well. There's a significant Jewish community in Germany today. The figures vary massively though, because when the Berlin Wall came down, there was about 200,000 people who had Jewish and ethnic German heritage in Eastern Europe who got automatic rights to live here in Germany. They gained automatic asylum rights to live here in Germany. So some figures say that it's as high as 200,000 Jewish Germans, and that other figures are a bit lower, that here in Berlin that there's about 20,000 Jewish people. And the main groups that make those up are, again, those Eastern European ethnic Germans who had a right to move here after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Russian Jews are a sizable, significant number as well. Exactly why they've chosen Berlin and that, I don't know for sure. And then the smallest, just about 2,000, but has got a lot of attention, is actually young Israelis as well. And that's gotten huge attention here in Berlin and also in Israel as well. Here in Berlin, of course, because it's significant that they're moving here back to Berlin despite the history here in it, and considering the factors that are drawing them here are quite simple. They're the same that draw a lot of young people to Berlin. Cheap cost of living, it's a cool city, lots of job opportunities and tech startups and things like that.